the trial of Karen Reed for the death of her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, is underway.
There are 17 jurors, and they're coming and going with a police escort.
I've seen a lot of things. I've never seen anything like this. This case never ceases to amaze me.
The first week of testimony has come to an end.
It's a spectacle, that's for sure.
We really heard the defense highlight some of the discrepancies between what was documented and what first responders said they remembered.
There are a lot of issues in this case.
Proctor was improperly searching Karen Reed's cell phone for nude photos.
The fact that the investigation wasn't thorough provides a big wrinkle in the prosecution's case.
They're supposed to be creating this reasonable doubt, and they're doing exactly that.
Everybody wants to know, us included, why he wouldn't go inside that home on the night that the body was discovered.
There are more people here at the beginning of this than at the beginning of Johnny Depp's trial.
It's always the theories or stories that each side will put forth, right, for a jury to listen to and decide which one is more believable.
We asked Karen Reed about that alleged confession. Karen, did you ever say I hit him?
I did not.
The FBI is investigating an investigation of a murder. That never, ever happens.
Karen Reed was drunk and angry and hit and killed John O'Keefe when she gunned it in the snowstorm.
We're looking at arm injuries with scratches. We're not looking at tire tracks.
I did not kill John O'Keefe. I've never harmed a hair on John O'Keefe's head.
Defense attorneys learn in school, first class, the most important thing you can do is identify and select stupid juries.
We're not concerned about any of the witnesses. None of the Commonwealth's witnesses are concerning us.
Karen Reed is facing up to life in prison.
I just hope justice is served for either one, whatever it is, you know.
The fate of her life is not in her hands anymore. It's not in the hands of her attorneys. It's not in the hands of the prosecutor. It's in the hands of the jury now.
Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed!
We have so much to catch up on, so I promised y'all a bonus episode this week along with the regular episode. I don't want to waste any time, so let's just jump right into it. Higgins wrapped up his testimony on the morning of day 18, at which point the cameras in the courtroom were turned off and no online streaming or reporting was allowed for the next two witnesses. John's niece and nephew, who are both still minors, were brought in to testify. Because streaming wasn't allowed for them, I can only give summaries of what was said based on the reporters' notes that were in the courtroom. Reporters weren't allowed to give live updates. No recording, no streaming, no live tweeting. Everything was done through taking notes and then reporting on what happened and what was said after the interviews were over. They were also asked not to use the niece and nephew's names in their reporting. The children weren't on the stand for too long, less than 2 hours total, and they were asked some of the same questions about John and Karen's relationship, what they witnessed, and of course, John's niece was asked about the morning of January 29th. His nephew testified that the relationship between John and Karen was sometimes rough. They had disagreements and arguments with yelling that became more frequent closer to John's death. His niece said their relationship was good at the beginning, but got bad toward the end. There was a time, sometime that January, where Karen and John got into an argument, and his niece said that John told Karen the relationship used to be fun and now it wasn't. It had run its course, so Karen got loud and was swearing. John's niece said that John told Karen to leave, but Karen didn't. They were both asked about the argument in Aruba, which they heard. John's nephew said that Karen was nice most of the time, and she would take them places. Both kids said that when she was upset, it usually resulted in Karen kind of ignoring or not looking at them. And his nephew said that there were a few times that they got in trouble and got yelled at. He gave an example of getting takeout food one night, and Karen got mad because she said that they didn't seem to appreciate it, so she put up a little bit of an attitude. John's nephew said that on the morning of January 23rd, Karen came over and looked sad. She was crying. I didn't see any of the reporters mention the significance of this date, but I do know that the 23rd was a Sunday morning, which is the day after John and Karen had gone to Hillside and hung out with Brian Albert and Chris and Julie Albert and the McCabe's and some others. One of the things that was interesting was the niece being asked about Karen's access to the computer upstairs. Part of the Commonwealth's theory is that Karen deleted Ring videos from John's Ring camera system on the computer. His niece was asked if Karen had access to the computer, and she said that she didn't think Karen had an account on the computer, but she could go in the room. Now, the defense theory seems to be that Karen didn't delete those videos, which is why they requested them from Ring and tried to get access to them. We know that they were accessed through John O'Keefe's Ring app on his phone, but that was done by the police, not Karen. And the information that they received from the subpoena from Ring doesn't have any information of deleted videos on the activity log. So this will be something that the jury will have to decide. We know that the police had access, but did Karen? John's niece gave her recollection of the morning of January 29th. She said that Karen woke her up around 4:30 a.m. and had her call Jen McCabe and some others. On one of the calls, she said that she heard Karen ask, "Could I have hit him or did I hit him?" Although Yannetti says that this was never mentioned during the interview on February 2nd at the DA's office. His niece said Karen was really on edge. She had never seen her that frantic. She was pacing around, and as she was calling more people, she was saying different things, like, "Did I hit him?" or "Did a snowplow hit him?" And in one conversation, she mentioned an argument, but in another, she didn't. She said that Jen McCabe, however, was relaxed. She told her that everything was going to be fine, and she was much calmer than Karen was. His niece also confirmed what we've heard about the garage door not closing that morning and said when Karen came back to the house after leaving the hospital, she remembers she went upstairs at some point. She said that Karen said that she felt like she was living in a nightmare and she left the house. Yannetti asked each of the teenagers if they knew the phrase, "raise a hand in anger," and asked if John or Karen ever had, and both kids said no. Yannetti concluded his brief cross-examination of John's nephew by saying, "I'm so sorry that you were made to come here today. Nothing further." At which point, Judge Beverly Cannoni struck the comment from the record. Outside the court after that day, Yannetti said that the prosecution's decision to call the children to testify was a desperate and inappropriate attempt to try to prove a non-existent motive that they failed to prove through their adult witnesses. The next witness to take the stand was Dr. Justin Rice from Good Samaritan Hospital Emergency Department. Dr. Rice referred to a copy of the medical chart for Officer John O'Keefe that he said that he would have dictated or produced, and also a code sheet that the nurses would have put together, and he would generally sign off on it, detailing whatever resuscitative efforts were made or performed on John O'Keefe's behalf. Dr. Rice said according to the chart, Officer O'Keefe arrived in the emergency department at 6:47 a.m., unresponsive and intubated with a breathing tube into his airway. CPR was in progress, and an endotracheal tube was being used to ventilate his lungs. He arrived in cardiac arrest, meaning his heart stopped functioning, so the CPR being performed was in an effort to force the blood to flow by physically pushing on his heart. Without the blood flowing from the heart, the organs begin to shut down, and a lack of oxygen to the brain after a certain amount of time can cause brain death or neurological issues. In the emergency department, Dr. Rice and the rest of the team are focusing on resuscitation efforts to prevent this if possible, and there are guidelines to how to do so. He explains that epinephrine, which is basically adrenaline that was used on John in hopes of increasing pressure and impacting the electrical function of his heart. Dr. Rice also discusses hypothermia. He said John's initial body temperature was low. The nurses documented his internal body temperature at 80.1 degrees Fahrenheit. Since cardiac arrest causes your blood to stop pumping, your body temperature will decrease over time. Average normal body temperature is 98.6 degrees, so John being at 80.1 falls in the parameters of hypothermic. Resuscitation efforts were made for this as well. They tried to warm him in a bear hugger, which is basically a blanket that has warm air being pumped through it. And they gave him an IV with fluids that were warmed in an oven of sorts. The idea is that if they are able to warm the body, the heart and other organs will function better. Unfortunately, after about half an hour, Dr. Rice said there wasn't a significant warming of John's core temperature, and he was pronounced dead at 7:50 a.m. Dr. Rice also gives the notes from his physical exam. He said that John had a 7-millimeter laceration on his right superior orbital ridge region. Now, this is the bone area above your eye socket. Think like where your eyebrows are. A laceration means that the skin was torn, usually by a sharp object, and a standard staple is about 8 millimeters long, so that gives you an idea of how big 7 millimeters is. There was also swelling of the soft tissue around this area. Dr. Rice says that John didn't have a pulse, and the abdominal exam was atraumatic, meaning there wasn't tissue injury, and John had superficial abrasions on his right forearm. Dr. Rice explains that abrasions are synonymous with scratches, so this would be where skin is rubbed or scraped off as opposed to a laceration with something sharp. Dr. Rice was also in the emergency department when Karen Reed was brought in, and he reads on her chart that her first vital signs were done at 7:51 a.m. Lally asked Dr. Rice what his typical involvement is on a patient that comes in under Section 12, and Dr. Rice explains that that can vary a lot depending on the patient and the nurse or nurse practitioner. An evaluation is done, and then they decide based on that if there's a need for a mental health consult. Vitals are done, and sometimes blood work. The blood work can answer some questions for the doctors. For example, if the patient is intoxicated on alcohol, it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to do a mental health evaluation because you're not going to be getting a true representation of what's going on. The process is basically to try to clear the patient medically and psychologically. Lally asked Dr. Rice if it's typical to draw blood for Section 12 to look for drugs or alcohol, and this is Dr. Rice's answer.
I mean, I'm hesitant to answer yes because of the word typical, because I wouldn't say there's really a typical presentation with respect to mental health presentations in the ER.
Dr. Rice said blood work was drawn for Karen Reed, and the alcohol screening came back as 93 milligrams per deciliter. During cross-examination, defense attorney Elizabeth Little asked Dr. Rice about treating Karen Reed. Dr. Rice said he was involved in her care, but he doesn't remember treating her, and he didn't write the reports regarding her care. They were done by a nurse practitioner. Little asked Dr. Rice about the blood collection.
Do you recall treating Ms. Reed at all?
No, I don't.
Do you recall actually ordering her blood in this case?
No.
Do you recall sending it out to the labs at all?
No.
As you sit here today, you don't know who collected the blood?
That's correct.
You don't know who packaged the blood?
That would also be a fair assessment, yes.
And you don't know who submitted that to the lab?
Correct.
And it wasn't you, correct?
I can confidently say that I did not collect blood work. I did not do that.
Okay.
Now, look, I saw that Dr. Rice got a lot of heat for this exchange. As someone who spent a lot of time in hospitals and emergency departments when I was going through cancer treatment, I can tell you that it is not strange that a doctor didn't have part in collecting Karen's blood. It's usually done by a phlebotomist or a nurse. And it's also not strange that he doesn't remember Karen specifically. Good Samaritan Medical Center is a level 3 trauma center, and the emergency department has 42 private rooms, plus 6 fast-track rooms, 9 ambulance bays, an imaging suite, an EMS room, decontamination room, double trauma bay, and 2 bays for cardiac care. Dr. Rice has seen a lot of patients in the last 2.5 years, so it's not expected that he would remember a Section 12 from 2022. Another interesting moment in the cross-examination came when Little asked Dr. Rice about treating John O'Keefe. She asked if a firefighter approached him that morning to tell him that the victim had been struck by a vehicle. Now, you'll remember that part of the testimony from Anthony Flamati was that he relayed that information to the hospital when they took John O'Keefe in. But Jackson pushed back on that, saying that he never wrote that in his narrative and had never said that to anyone else before the day that he testified in this trial. So Dr. Rice said that he doesn't remember a firefighter approaching him to inform him of this, but he thought that he remembered it being in the report that an EMS had told them that. Little, of course, had the report available, and after looking at it, Dr. Rice acknowledges that there is no mention of a vehicle anywhere in the report after all. Dr. Rice agrees that there's no mention of any broken bones or fractures from the neck down anywhere in his report of Officer O'Keefe. But he says their focus and the focus of his team was on resuscitation efforts. So there wasn't the extra focus on injuries or observations that don't coincide with those efforts. Basically, they were trying to save John. They're not doing a full skeletal x-ray because that's not within the realm of resuscitation. The next two witnesses were Dr. Gary Fowler and Nicholas Roberts. Now, I want to talk about them together because they are both testifying to discuss the blood alcohol levels and conversion methods for Karen Read. Dr. Fowler is the chief of pathologists at Good Samaritan and also the lab medical director. His job is to ensure the quality of the anatomic pathology side of things as well as the clinical pathology side of things. Basically, making sure that any lab reports coming from Good Samaritan are accurate. For the blood test, Dr. Fowler says that the phlebotomists don't use alcohol wipes when testing for alcohol so that they don't contaminate the sample. And he goes over the policy for how things are done. I'm not going to bother going into details on this. It's all pretty standard stuff, like having the patient say their name out loud and checking it against their ID bracelet, etc. Dr. Fowler explains that in the hospital, they are in the business of reporting alcohol in serum or plasma, not in the business of the legal aspects of testing for alcohol. So they don't make any conversions. That's not their thing. In order to do conversions, they'd have to validate and do a bunch of studies, and they're just not there for that purpose. Dr. Fowler said that he knows that there's a formula that can be used, but says that there's varying opinions on that formula. This is really interesting, and attorney Elizabeth Little questions Dr. Fowler on this during cross. There are differences in screening tests conducted in hospitals and forensic tests that are done in labs. The testing that Dr. Fowler mentioned is to get quick diagnosis and treatment of a patient, which is why they use serum tests. They're not measuring alcohol directly. It's actually measuring the presence of a byproduct that's created when the body is breaking the alcohol down. There are some factors that can cause the test to appear elevated, and Dr. Fowler says that their machine will flag those as possible interferences, and in some cases, it won't even let them complete the test. But there were no flags that showed up on the testing for Karen Read's blood. Dr. Fowler mentioned not being involved in the forensic type of blood testing and not being involved in the conversions, but the next witness, Nicholas Roberts, is a forensic scientist at the Massachusetts State Crime Lab, and he does exactly that. Roberts is the one who used the formula to convert Karen's 93 milligram per deciliter serum alcohol reading to a possible range of blood alcohol content. Using the formula to calculate the blood alcohol content at various times prior to the blood sample being drawn is called retrograde extrapolation. This was actually the subject of one of the pretrial motions from the defense, who wanted to exclude this testimony since the blood was not collected from the police or at a forensics lab, and the range of Karen's estimated blood alcohol level is a pretty wide range. Roberts said that they calculated it to be between 0.07% and 0.08% at the time of the blood draw, but the range estimated at the time of John's death is between 0.135% and 0.292%. For reference, the legal limit for a DUI is 0.08% in Massachusetts. So that range is a huge swing, like 120%. And Lally said in the pretrial motion that that's because math. In order to calculate this, Roberts used 12:45 a.m. as the time of the last drink and 9:08 a.m. as the time that the blood was drawn, of course. The estimated time of 12:45 may be off some, but Roberts said that it won't change the calculations too much if it's within minutes because they do their time calculations in about 50-minute intervals. Another problem with these estimates, and another reason that the defense argued to have them excluded, are the issues with so many unknowns. The serum to blood conversion can vary a lot from person to person, and the time of the last drink is unknown. And with so many unknown variables, it's impossible to get a more narrow estimate. Also, since Massachusetts State Lab didn't collect the blood themselves, their retrograde extrapolation calculations don't actually meet their accreditation standards. Another reason that the defense fought to have these excluded. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. This year has flown by. I cannot believe that summer is already here. What's something that you're proud of in 2024? Is there something that you still want to accomplish before the end of the year? When life goes fast, it's important to take a moment to celebrate your wins and make adjustments for the rest of the year. Therapy isn't just for those who have experienced major trauma. It can help you take stock of your progress and set achievable goals for the next 6 months. It's helpful for developing a positive outlook, learning healthy, productive coping skills, navigating relationships, and it empowers you to be the best version of yourself. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapist at any time for no additional charge. Take a moment. Visit betterhelp.com/juror today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/juror. Next up was Michael Trotta, who has been the Canton Public Works Superintendent for more than 20 years. Mr. Trotta has a long list of responsibilities, including overall operations and long-term scheduling. In February of 2022, Proctor called Mr. Trotta to ask about the procedure for staffing a snowstorm. Mr. Trotta explains that the town is divided up into almost 30 different plow routes for the drivers, and Canton has almost 40 trucks. Plus, there were another 30 private trucks. Usually those are a little bit smaller. They try to have 2 trucks on every route, but it's not always possible when they don't have enough. He tries to have 1 town truck assisted by 1 private truck that is procured through a bid process. When they know that snow is coming, they usually try to set up the schedules about 12 to 18 hours before so that the drivers know what to expect. Mr. Trotta said that when Proctor called, he thinks he asked who was assigned to Fairview area to plow. Mr. Trotta has what's called a plow plan, and the one for the day of the snowstorm from January 29th is entered into evidence. They discuss this document, and Mr. Trotta explains that the drivers go out in stages. So there's a crew set out to go at 2 a.m., and then the private contractors go out at 3 a.m., and it was all completed and everybody went home at 5 a.m. On the route for Fairview was Brian Laughlin, aka Lucky, in a 4300 International medium-duty truck. Mr. Trotta estimates that Lucky would have been sitting up about 4 to 4.5 feet. For comparison, he says that's about 2 feet higher than you would sit in a standard car. He thinks that he may have identified Lucky for Proctor, but he said that he doesn't have a memory of his exact questions. He said he does remember that Proctor asked him about the plow list, and on that list is a company called By the Yard, which is one of the independent contractors, and a first name and last initial for their drivers. And Mr. Trotta said that he knows that Brian L. would be Brian Laughlin, and he thinks that he may have told Proctor that and referred him to the operations manager to double check who was on plowing that day, just to be sure. He said that Proctor didn't ask him that day to talk to Lucky on the phone, and his conversation with Proctor actually only lasted about 2 or 3 minutes, and he doesn't remember Proctor ever following up with him after that. Now, it's important to remember, he's talking about this plow schedule and having Brian, Lucky, Laughlin on the schedule, and remember, Proctor did not talk to Lucky until like 21 months later. We moved through witnesses pretty fast on day 18. After Mr. Trotta, we heard from Louis Jutras, who works in the Information Systems Division for the Town of Canton Finance Department, and he was asked to provide surveillance videos from the Canton Library security cameras. Jutras said that Lieutenant Gallagher contacted him and said that the state police would be contacting him to request some video footage. When the trooper reached out, he asked for footage from the Pequiside Farm and for anything at Town Hall or the Canton Library that faced Washington Street. The timeframes requested were between midnight and 1 a.m. and between 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. on January 29th. Now, the video from the farm is one of the possible routes that Karen can take from Fairview or Jen McCabe's to John's house. And those cameras cover mostly the property and less of the street out front. But there is one camera that's facing down the driveway directly to the street. The library video is motion activated, and the video gets overwritten usually after about 30 days. Now, the request for the video came in by February 7th, so that was plenty of time, and Jutras put the videos together and sent a file share link with the information to the troopers. He wasn't told what kind of car to look for or anything like that, just the times. So he didn't actually watch the whole video or anything like that. He just checked it for the timestamps at the start and at the end. Now, remember, the defense said in a pretrial hearing that there is footage from the Canton library that's missing during the 2 minutes that Karen Reed would have been driving by, and they said that that footage would show her taillight still intact. I'll be honest, when you look at the video, it's not footage that I think would be clear enough or close enough to exonerate her if the taillight is or isn't broken. Some of the video that has been closer and clearer is still really difficult to see, but the defense has brought this video up before. The problem, according to the pretrial hearing, is that they didn't get the file share link password that was given to the troopers, and by the time it was given to them, it had expired. So the copy of the video that they have from the library is the copy that the troopers and the prosecution made from their access to the file share link that is now no longer available. So keeping this in mind, there was a moment when Lally went to enter the video as evidence, and the witness looked at this disc and said, "That's not mine."
Sir, I'm showing you a disc. Just ask you to, as far as that video from the Canton Public Library, you've seen that video subsequently, is that correct?
This disc with the wording on it?
Yes.
No, I have not seen this.
Not that specific disc, I'm sorry, sir, but the footage, have you been shown that particular video footage, or did you review that footage before you gave it to the troopers?
This is not mine to the trooper.
Understood. May we approach?
Okay.
Yannetti asks on cross-examination about missing footage, and Jutra says that he didn't watch the video, so he wouldn't know if anything was missing or not. He only checked the timestamps requested and sent a link, so all he knows is that he didn't delete anything. He said that the troopers could have asked him to download and preserve the video so that it didn't get overwritten, but that wasn't a request that was made to him, so he didn't do it. So the raw footage is gone. Juchas also says that part of his duties are the GPS on the town trucks, and he received notification on February 1st from the operations manager that the GPS on the trucks was not working during the snowstorm. Now, this isn't too unusual, apparently. He said that it happens several times a year for various reasons, sometimes related to the network. We got to see the video, and you can also see in the clips that it showed, there was not a lot of snow on the ground at all during the video clips from midnight to 1 a.m. There was a lot more snow on the ground, of course, between 5 to 6 a.m. On day 19, we had our first member of the Massachusetts State Police finally take the stand. Lieutenant Kevin O'Hara gave us an introduction to the Special Emergency Response Team, or CERT, and the collection of evidence from the search later in the day, after Canton PD was gone. O'Hara is the team commander, and he testified that Lieutenant Brian Tully, who is the lead of the State Police Detective Unit at Norfolk County District Attorney's Office, called him to 34 Fairview the afternoon that John O'Keefe was killed. Tully told him that they were conducting a death investigation in Canton and they needed assistance with a search. O'Hara was able to respond, but it took him time due to the blizzard-like conditions. He was cleared for his team to respond around 3:45 that afternoon, and he told them to bring shovels and brooms and rakes, things that they could use to go through the snow. He and his team conducted a search in the front yard at Fairview for about an hour, and he says that they located 6 or 7 pieces of taillight and the missing shoe from Officer O'Keefe. Proctor was not on scene while the searches were being conducted, but defense asked about Proctor almost immediately during cross-examination. Yannetti also asked about the state police taking over the crime scene from Canton Police Department, who left the scene unattended for 6 to 7 hours before their search began. O'Hara said that he wasn't aware of it being left open, and he didn't know that Canton Police Department had been conflicted out of the investigation before he and his team arrived. He was asked to look for the missing shoe and pieces of taillight, but was never asked to look inside the home. By the time the search team arrived, it was around 5, and the sun had set, so the search was done in the dark using headlamps. He said they were able to uncover multiple pieces of red and clear taillight and the sneaker in the area between the flagpole and the fire hydrant. Some of it was found in snowdrifts. There wasn't any kind of mapping of the exact location that things were found, which Yannetti brought up when questioning about the integrity of the crime scene. But he said that the team did set up a grid search around where the car was believed to have been parked the night before. O'Hara said that after finding some of the taillight pieces, he asked to see a photo of the car to know how much of the taillight was broken and what they were looking for. But Tully told him that the car was being towed back to Canton Police Department, so he could not get a picture. The search ended around 6:15, but O'Hara told Tully that they could return the next day during daylight hours to search more. One of the important things that O'Hara brought up is the time of the first piece that they found at Fairview, which was around 5:45. Now, part of the defense's theory is that the taillight pieces are planted. So Karen's car was being brought to the Sallyport and first seen on video around 5:30. The CERT team arrived at Fairview at different times. One arrived at 5, one arrived at 5:15, 5:30, 5:45. So there are different times of arrival for the different team members, but the first piece was found at 5:45. We're going to get into depth into the timeline during Proctor's testimony, but I wanted to bring it up now because that was an important piece of information from this testimony. Maureen Hartnett also testified on day 19. She's a forensic scientist with the State Police Crime Lab. Now, we've heard this name a lot in pretrial hearings, specifically about the apparent hair. She is a scientist that defense said failed her proficiency exam, so they said that she was not qualified to identify the apparent hair found on Karen's car as a human hair. So Hartnett addresses this and said that she made an error identifying hair, which led her prior work to being examined and additional training. On February 1st, Hartnett reported to the Canton Police Department, Sallyport, to examine Karen Reed's SUV. She conducted an overall physical evaluation of the car for anything that could be reported for the investigation, and she said that the car was in overall good condition, but there was damage to the rear passenger side area. There was a small dent in the trunk door, scratches on the rear bumper, and of course the broken taillight. Now, Hartnett is also the one who saw the apparent hair on the rear quarter panel and some pieces of apparent glass on the bumper. Hartnett performed blood screening on the undercarriage of the vehicle, the bumper, and the tires, but it was negative. Now, this was interesting to me because I've always wondered about the scratches on John O'Keefe's arm. I remembered my interview with Dr. Kenneth Kinsey about how the prosecution would need to find a way to explain the injuries on John's arm and line them up with something else. I thought if they were able to do that with the underneath of the car, that it could make more sense that she hit him, but there was nothing found under the car. So that's ruled out. Hartnett collected the apparent hair and glass, as well as the taillight housing, several paint standards, the broken drinking glass found at the scene, and the red Solo cups with frozen red-brown stains inside. She examined the hair and believed it to be consistent with human hair with a root, but she said that she was unsure of which part of the body the hair came from. She performed tests on John's hoodie because she said that it had several red-brown stains in several areas, his t-shirt, his shoe, and test confirms that the stains on his shirt and shoe were blood. Now, I'm also hoping to hear more about this when the medical examiner testifies. For a drop of blood to be on his shoe and what we know from his injuries and how he was found, I need to understand how blood would have dropped or splattered on his shoe when the injuries were all to his arm and his head. I know that blood drips down to your shoe if you're standing, but I just don't know how to make sense of this from the Commonwealth's theory. Also, the holes and tears in John's sleeve seem to coincide with the injuries to his arm. These tears are where the swabs were taken to be sent for canine DNA testing. As for the solo cups, she said that they were not labeled in any way, and she didn't actually test them at all. She said that she allowed the frozen red-brown stains to thaw and then took 2 swabs to be analyzed from an outside lab, but she took them from just one of the solo cups because she just assumed that they were all related. No DNA testing was ever done on the blood swab. Similarly, she only took 1 swab from the taillight housing, noting that it was, quote, all one swab, one detection, end quote. Another question was about this apparent hair that she found. It wasn't attached to the car in any way. It was just kind of on the car. Now, on cross-examination, Alan Jackson pointed out that the car would have made a 60-mile trip in the middle of a blizzard with this apparent hair stuck without somehow coming off, and the pieces of glass that were found on the bumper would have made this 60-mile trip and somehow not have been blown off. It seems unlikely when this is said out loud, but I'm not an expert. The jury will have to decide what they think. I want to skip ahead to the testimony of the results of all of this testing. It doesn't come for a couple days later in the trial, but I just want to go ahead and get this part out of the way. The hair was, of course, tested at the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab, and no human DNA was detected. It was sent for mitochondrial DNA testing at Bodie Labs, and their testing showed a match to John O'Keefe. The DNA from the taillight was confirmed to be John O'Keefe, but also showed the DNA of 2 other individuals who are unknown and unrelated, though Proctor and Buchanan were ruled out as contributors. I think that if the taillight DNA had been only John's and not a mix of multiple people, or if it had been from blood or tissue, I think that it would have had more of an impact to me or to the jury, but it isn't quite the proverbial smoking gun. The stains that were tested on John's clothing and shoe were a match for his blood, no surprise there, and the DNA profile on the drinking glass matched John as well. And no surprise there either, we saw him leave with it in his hand on that video. So what were they able to do with those taillight pieces? We'll go over that right after this. So the jury heard about the taillight pieces that were collected, as well as the glass fragments, and about them being put back together and how they were able to match things up. Analysts worked to reconstruct the taillight out of the pieces that were collected. They taped it together and then showed how it could all have come from the same piece. Now, a lot of this testimony is really technical stuff about procedures and analysis, and then having to go through each of the pieces and which pieces came on what day and from what search and was signed by who. And I noticed that some of the reporters in the room had commented on how the jury had kind of looked away and weren't as engaged as they normally are. And I can understand why. This testimony took a really long time. So the perk of getting to listen in the podcast is that we get to skip all of that and I can get right to the point. Ashley Valier is a trace analyst in the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab. She performed what she called physical match analysis on bits of apparent red and clear plastic in the debris from Officer John O'Keefe's clothing, including his jeans, boxers, hoodie, and t-shirt, and said that she noted apparent dirt debris. There was also a straw, plastic, and glass. But on cross-examination, Yannetti questions Valier about her analysis, and we hear that she didn't actually examine John's clothing directly. She examined the debris from his shirt. In that debris, she found pieces of red and clear plastic that she then sent on to another analyst for further examination. So we've been hearing for a while now that microscopic taillight pieces were found embedded in John O'Keefe's clothing. I was expecting to hear a little more about this, but Valier said that it was given to her for analysis as a separate item, specifically labeled as the debris. There wasn't an actual shirt in there that she was digging these pieces out of. So part of the defense's theory is that the taillight pieces were planted, but we heard about these microscopic pieces. So I was expecting testimony about how they were actually embedded in the fabric of the shirt, but instead Valier said that they came in the package that was separated into 3 categories. One was dirt and debris, one was several apparent hairs, which were never tested, and the third was the pieces of the apparent plastic, which measured approximately 1/8 of an inch by 1/16 of an inch. Now, she said that she doesn't know what the person who packaged it did to collect that. Valier had no control over how the evidence was handled before it came into her possession. And she says that they have a chain of custody in the lab, but she didn't follow the evidence as it went through the chain. Yannetti asks her which trooper delivered the items to her, and this was the response.
Well, which state trooper delivered the pieces of red and clear plastic pieces, I should say, that you just testified about?
The item 7-5 to 7-19?
Right. The several pieces of red apparent plastic and one piece of clear apparent plastic measuring 1/8 of an inch by 1/16 of an inch. That's what I'm referring to.
Wait, sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes. You understand what I'm talking about, right? In terms of the several pieces of red apparent plastic and then the one piece of clear plastic that you have the measurements for?
You're talking about the apparent plastic that I noted in the debris of 7-18.18?
Correct. Which state trooper was it that delivered that?
Do you know?
Sorry, that's an odd question.
I don't know if you want her to repeat it, Ms. Giannetti. Go ahead. You have to repeat that, please.
So evidence is submitted to...
What you just said that he missed.
Oh, I said that's kind of an odd question.
Oh, not for me.
So...
Do you have a record of that?
A record of what?
A record of which state trooper delivered that debris to the lab.
So it wouldn't be delivered as debris. It would be delivered as the individual piece of clothing, which then got assigned item 7-18, I believe. And then as someone analyzes it, each offshoot of that piece of evidence gets a 7-18 point something. So the debris collected from that shirt is 7-18.18.
Okay, all right. Listen, when those several, actually, let me strike that. Get to where I was.
Take your time, Ms. Giannetti.
Okay, so I want to confirm with you that when you were assigned to this case, you were aware that the date of the incident was January 29th of 2022, correct?
Yes.
All right. And it's your testimony that you don't know which state trooper delivered the shirts to the lab, correct?
I could look at my notes because I have a printed chain of custody.
Sure. If you would check your notes for that, please.
Okay. So. Okay, so submission 7, which is everything that's item 7- in this case, was submitted by Trooper Michael Proctor, I believe.
Oh, that was the answer to my question. Thank you.
So Proctor brought in the clothing, and someone else at the lab separated the dirt and debris, apparent hairs, and plastic, and then she analyzed it. But the pieces were not actually embedded in the clothing. The note says that Proctor dropped the clothing off on March 14th, 2022, which was about 6 weeks after John O'Keefe's death. There were a few interesting things that came up during cross-examination that could potentially support the defense's theory and show reasonable doubt. One, the pieces submitted to the lab by Proctor were larger than the pieces found by other troopers. Now, you would think that the initial search would have found the bigger pieces, and the searches after would have found the smaller, harder to find ones. It doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it could show the jury that taillight pieces were found later that are bigger, could have been possibly planted. The other thing is that when they put the taillight back together, it was missing a piece that was never found. This could also potentially support the defense's theory. So if Karen did in fact crack her taillight when she backed into John O'Keefe's car, could that piece that's missing have fallen inward during the impact, back in toward the taillight housing? Carrie Roberts testified that she saw a small piece missing, and Officer Nicholas Barros, who testified on day 22, said that when he went to Karen Reed's parents' house at the time that the tow truck was going to get the car from the driveway, the taillight, he said, was not completely damaged. It was cracked and a piece was missing, but he said it was not completely damaged.
I saw that there was some damage to the right rear taillight. To my best ability and recollection, that taillight was not completely damaged. It was cracked and a piece was missing, but not completely damaged.
Of course, the photos that we saw later from the Sally Port show that taillight completely damaged. So it's hard to say. It seems like this could definitely be interpreted either way by jurors. It's just going to depend on what they believe. The other really interesting part is that the glass that was found was analyzed by Christina Hanley, along with some other things. So some of the glass was able to be fit together, and there were 4 items that Christina analyzed, though she put some into subcategories and labeled them to keep track. So the first was a single item, like just a cup. The second was the bumper that had 5 subcategories, and the third was multiple pieces of clear apparent glass and multiple pieces of plastic. And the final was a single piece of glass from Proctor. So here's what's interesting. She was able to match up some of this plastic and glass, but the only thing that the glass on the bumper was consistent with was the one piece that Proctor turned in. And the piece that Proctor turned in was only a match to the glass on the bumper. So where did this glass come from, and how come it doesn't match the single item cup piece or pieces? Why are we almost to the end of the Commonwealth's case and we still have questions? How are we still finding doubt? The next 2 episodes are going to be packed. There's a lot of information to get in. There's going to be some explosive texts from Proctor. You don't want to miss that, but you might not want to listen with your kids in the room. The cell tower data from Karen Reed the morning that she left to go find John. Did she go back to Fairview like we thought she may have? And the data from her car. Is the Commonwealth finally about to put their case together for the jury? Will they be able to close the gap of reasonable doubt? Or has too much damage been done already? Are we any closer to justice for Officer John O'Keefe? We'll find out next time. My name is Brandi Churchwell, creator of 13th Juror Podcast. If you're enjoying it, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and share this episode with your friends. For more information, photos, and episode guides, visit our website at 13thjurorpodcast.com.